Hi folks, Dr. P here with a somewhat longer video than usual. I'm going to talk about who is winning in a tabletop or even video game, but mainly tabletop, since a great many video games are actually puzzles rather than games. And I'm going to use an example from the Ukraine war. So in the end, I have to admit this is mostly about the Ukraine war. Uh, there's a broad question that's important to game design, and that is who is winning, figuring that out long before the game ends. Some games have no victory conditions like many tabletop RPGs, but players may still feel they are winning or losing depending on their objectives. In many games, it's hard to tell who is ahead. My own game Britannia is a case in point. It's a 4-player game. Players accrue points at different times and at different rates. So becoming familiar with the system includes becoming familiar with when various nations score and how much they score. And that helps you recognize who's winning the game. In other games, it can be clear long before the end who is winning. In my playtesting with mostly college students, I find that the players often don't recognize who is winning when I do. And of course, I may also be more familiar with the game, but I am able to think strategically in game terms, and a lot of people don't do that very well. So the result may actually be settled long before the game ends. And I remember a quote from J.C. Lawrence, who suggested that maybe half the time when people played a Euro game, the result was actually had been determined halfway through the game and people didn't recognize it. I remember a very long Eclipse game that I watched where the outcome was clear halfway through the game, but the people didn't recognize it. So I'm using the Ukraine war as an example of how complicated victory can be, and I'll have some other comments related to games. Now, in the Ukraine war, first you need to know the objectives. Ukraine wants all their pre-2014 territory back. Russia originally wanted a Ukrainian puppet, as in the old Iron Curtain times, or obliteration of Ukraine entirely, but may have shorter term goals for now, since they're very far from their original goals. And keep in mind, this is a war, not a battle. There are several areas of conflict. The Black Sea, Crimea, Russia, the front lines, in the air, and in the economy. And I'm going to go through these one by one, although not in that order, to show that in some cases one side may be winning, in other cases it may be a stalemate. And you've got to put that all together to figure out who's actually winning the war, or if it were a game, who's actually winning the game. So I'm going to talk about economy first because long wars are economic. Russia is far bigger than Ukraine, but it suffers under sanctions. And Russia recently stopped gasoline exports for 6 months because of shortages at home, which is not good for a country that exports a lot of oil. The ruble has lost a lot of value. It's not used internationally anymore. Even the Indians want to pay for Russian oil with rupees, not with rubles. And the Russians are using up their money reserves rapidly. And I'm not talking about the money that's frozen in Western countries. I'm talking about the money reserve they built up in Russia. Now, Ukraine depends on the West economically, of course, although securing the Eastern Black Sea has helped because they can export grain that way. The West has an enormously larger economy than Russia. It's nothing like the West versus the Soviet Union. Russia is a much weaker country than the Soviet Union was. But there are questions of will and of finding ammunition. On the other hand, even Russian arms exports are dying. partly because the Russians need everything at home, and partly because countries see that the Russians are not doing it all well with their arms in Ukraine. Now, the front lines is a stalemate. The gains and losses by either side are minuscule since the Ukrainians took Kherson. The Russians suffer enormous losses, visual confirmation for vehicles, but they feel that enormous losses are tolerable and they push forward very, very slowly. Unfortunately, some people are mesmerized by lines on maps. When the lines don't shift, they decide that nobody's winning. Well, nobody is winning at the front. It's a stalemate. But that's not true of the war as a whole. And of course, Ukraine is now suffering from supply and ammunition shortages thanks to the idiocy of the American House of Representatives in the face of a new Cold War. Crimea, the Ukrainians have increased their missile and drone range, and their attacks have forced the Russian Navy and Air Force to retreat, in some cases as far as to Russian territory. The Kerch Bridge has been damaged twice, despite its distance from Ukrainian-held territory. Logistics are a big problem for the Russians, and the best route to much of the front was through Crimea. But that bridge is very vulnerable. So Crimea has become a problem for Russia, not an advantage. And I'd have to say that in this theater of operations, you might say, the Ukrainians are winning. The Black Sea. Russians are frequently losing warships to a country that has no navy to speak of. There's no real defense against marine drones. Firing the head of the Navy and of the Black Sea Fleet, which happened recently, won't make a difference. It's a technological problem. On the other hand, Ukrainians are now able to export some grain by sea despite the end of the grain agreement. The Russians evidently are unwilling to use submarines to sink merchant ships, which probably makes sense because there'd be a tremendous outcry if they did it. So it sounds like in the Black Sea, the Russians are losing. In the air, the Russian Air Force is vastly larger than the Ukrainian. Yet they are being forced farther and farther from the front lines. In recent days, they've lost a dozen or so of their best planes. They have trouble getting Western parts to repair aircraft or to build new ones. Sounds like losing to me in a situation where they really would be expected to win. In Russia itself, the Russians are unable to stop partisan activity in Russia, unable to stop drone attacks in Russia, not even able to stop incursions of Russian opposition groups into Belgorod. The repeated Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries may be a crippling blow, though the Chinese could sell refined petroleum products to Russia. But what is, for a country that depends on its oil, that's pretty bad. And of course, the Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure usually involve bombing apartments, schools, and hospitals, as well as actual, possibly military targets. There are technology differences in the war as well, because Ukraine gets some weapons from the West. And Russia has lost some of the Soviet Union's capabilities. Ukraine benefits from technology much more than Russia does. This also impacts who is winning and is a situation where the Ukrainians are winning. Now, in terms of strategy, we have direct versus indirect strategy, which I've talked about in several articles and videos. And it's very difficult to summarize in a few words, but direct is kind of smash face in your mouth, go straight at them. Like the Russians with their meat wave attacks and artillery. And indirect is to find places where the other side is not defending, to employ trickery, to employ methods other than smash mouth in your face. Russia is direct in Ukraine, and Ukraine is indirect. Games themselves can be quite direct, which is often true of depictions of 1 to 3 day battles, or they can be quite indirect. The direct are likely to have simpler victory conditions than the indirect if you think about it. So what about point games? Many tabletop games are won by accumulating points. They can be indirect, even as the point totals may be obvious. There can be points that aren't revealed to other players until the end. This enables the designers to place varying emphasis on several aspects of play rather than one. In the case of Ukraine, a point game for the war makes a lot of sense. You could give points for territory, perhaps by oblast, points for sea control, points for economy, and so on and so forth, covering the areas I've been talking about. Keep in mind, part of what makes a game and not a puzzle is uncertainty about who is winning. So trying to determine who is winning is very important in opposed games, at least, where you're playing against someone or something else. Thanks for listening.